Hi students, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the process of speciation. So we know that when two different groups or two different populations have different selection pressures, they change over time. But the question is, when have they changed so much that they're now two different species? I mean, when you look at two different dogs, you might look at a golden retriever and a Great Dane and go, those dogs are so different from one another. They must be different species. But in fact, they're not. They can interbreed. And so we say, no, they're both dogs. But maybe you look at a wolf and a fox and you go, well, they should be the same species. Or a grizzly bear and a polar bear. They should be the same species, but in fact, they're not. And so sometimes the rules about who's the same species and who's different species seem arbitrary or unclear. And so in this little section of the chapter, we're going to try to understand how we know if two things are the same species and how we can tell when they're different species. Before we can do that, we have to define what is a species. So a species is a group of populations with the potential to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. It's not enough that two populations could interbreed. Bottlenose dolphins from the coast of California and maybe from more north by Washington, they are the same species. They can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. A shark and a dolphin is not the same species. They cannot interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So there's two pieces here. One is, can they reproduce? Can those two species have an offspring? And so we know that like a mule is a hybrid of a donkey and a horse. Grizzly bears and polar bears could have an offspring. But are those offspring, are those babies able to reproduce again? Are they fertile offspring? And the answer in all of those cases is no. So in the case of a mule is now a sterile offspring. So in order for two species to be the same, they need to be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So now we know that a horse and a donkey are two different species because although they can interbreed, they cannot create fertile offspring. A mule, their offspring is not fertile. This is the biological species concept. And of course, it only applies to organisms that reproduce sexually. Organisms that reproduce asexually have to be defined as a species in another way, and we're really not going to dive into that particularly in this chapter. We're just looking at organisms that reproduce sexually. So there were two parts to our biological species concept. Part one, can they reproduce, interbreed? And step two, are those offspring fertile? And so when we talk about the things that separate two species, we talk about there are some things that prevent the original baby. We call those pre-zygotic. So this is a good time to stop and say that when a sperm first fertilizes an egg, and that cell goes from being haploid to being diploid again, and it's going to develop into an offspring, we call that moment, that fertilized egg, it is called a zygote. So if something is a pre-zygotic barrier, it is preventing fertilization. If something is a post-zygotic barrier, it is preventing the second half of the biological species concept. It's preventing and produce fertile offspring. The first pre-zygotic barriers prevent two species can interbreed. The second post-zygotic barriers prevent and produce fertile offspring. So we're looking at the two concepts of our species barrier. So this is a picture of a mule in the center, and this is a horse over here, and this is a donkey. And so the mule is a hybrid between a horse and a donkey. And so when the mule is born, it usually has, its mom is usually the horse, and the mule is born and it grows up and it's a very strong organism. However, the mule is also sterile. That means that the mule cannot go on to have any more babies, baby mules. The only way you get a baby mule is to breed a horse with a donkey. You can't get a baby mule by breeding a mule with a mule. They just can't do it. So this is an example of a post-zygotic barrier because the mule is not fertile, but it is alive. So the horse and the donkey were able to interbreed, they just couldn't produce fertile offspring. So this is an example of a post-zygotic barrier. We're going to take some moments now and we're going to look at the different examples of pre-zygotic barriers. So in pre-zygotic barriers, we're preventing fertilization. So this is a list of all of the ways that we could prevent fertilization. The first one is temporal isolation. Temporal is time. So if you are fertile at different times of year, this happens with flowers a lot. Right now, Creighton myrtles, which is a type of flower, they're blooming and it's in the spring. In another time of year, you might see flowers blooming in the fall. They would not be able to interbreed because they are fertile at different times of year. A second zygotic barrier would be habitat isolation. So these animals might be in the same general area, but not in the same habitat. So a particular bug might grow and develop on white flowers, and a different one might grow and develop on yellow flowers. And if the bugs never change locations, the ones that are born on the white flowers only live on white flowers, and the ones born on yellow flowers only live on yellow flowers, then you would expect that those two organisms would never interbreed because they would never see each other. They would be in two different flowers all of the time. Another prevention of fertilization is behavioral isolation. And so this is when there is some sort of courtship ritual or courtship behavior, and the one species just doesn't do the right courtship behavior for the other species. Right here, this is a fiddler crab, and fiddler crabs take their large claw. So they have one big claw and they have one little claw. See, it's little claw over here. They take their large claw and they actually do this like claw dance. That is how they attract their mate. So if the crab does the wrong fiddler dance, the other crabs are like, oh, no, 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 you're doing the wrong dance. I am not attracted to you. And so they wouldn't have a chance to mate. In that way, you can find 12 different species of fiddler crabs on the same habitat, right, on the same beach, fertile at the same time of year, no temporal isolation, but their behavioral isolation has prevented them from mating amongst each other. The fourth type of pre-zygotic barrier is a mechanical isolation. The parts don't fit. End of story. You try to mate, you can't mate. Parts don't fit. It's just not going to work. And the fifth kind is gametic isolation. So in gametic isolation, you have maybe an egg and they're fertile at the same time, they're in the same place, they have the right behaviors to find each other attractive, the parts fit, but when the sperm reaches the egg, it is unable to fertilize the egg, and so then there is no zygote. All of these things prevent the formation of a zygote, prevent the formation of an offspring. So these are all the pre-zygotic barriers. We also have post-zygotic barriers. So let's say we are able to get fertilization, but after fertilization, the offspring just isn't healthy, isn't virile, or isn't fertile. So one is reduced hybrid viability. So in reduced hybrid viability, the zygote is formed but not born. So even though you can make the zygote does not go on to form a live offspring. Reduced hybrid fertility is when we see, like the mule, that the horse and the donkey can go ahead and have this offspring, and the offspring seems healthy enough, but it cannot reproduce. And then lastly, hybrid breakdown is where it seems like everything's going okay. The first generation seems good to go, but by the second generation, things kind of fall apart and they're not able to sustain a species. And so that's an indication that they are two separate species. So you can imagine that as we go down the line, we are closer and closer related. You expect that things that have hybrid breakdown or reduced hybrid fertility to indicate species that are more closely related than species that have mechanical or behavioral isolation. Different types of speciation might indicate the relative relatedness of the two species. You may have heard the riddle before, which came first, the chicken or the egg? By the way, from a biological standpoint, this is a really easy answer. The egg came first. If your question is which came first, the chicken or the chicken egg, you might have a little bit more of a good riddle there. But you know, the egg existed with dinosaurs and chickens evolved way later. So the egg definitely came first. That being said, we need to look and see, does a reproductive barrier arise and then the two organisms become different species? Or do they become different species and eventually the reproductive barrier arises? And the answer to that is yes. In certain circumstances, the barrier arises first, like a Grand Canyon separates the squirrels, or a temporal isolation changes when the pollen is able to fertilize eggs in a particular flower, or there's a mechanical isolation and the two organisms can no longer interbreed. When the barrier arises first and then the two species diverge after that, that's called allopatric speciation. There is a separation first. But in some populations, the species are living right there and they diverge and they diverge and they diverge until eventually they create a reproductive barrier and then they become separated. And that's called sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is more common in asexual species, mostly because in sympatric speciation, you need to have at least two species that have the same reproductive barrier arise in order to have them be able to sexually reproduce. So it would be more difficult in sexual reproduction because you would need to essentially be struck by lightning twice in order to get the exact same mutations to occur in two different organisms living at the same time. Where allopatric speciation, what happens is we get a group of organisms that are all living together, and eventually they've diverged from another population that are also all living together. And so it's this one slower over time. So sympatric speciation, you can think of it as meaning that they have the same homeland, where allopatric speciation means that they have two different homelands and then they form new species. The last question we can ask ourselves is whether evolution is fast or slow. For me, evolution seems really slow. I mean, we talk about all of these great changes in the evolution of the eye or the evolution of the foot or the leg bones. I don't see any of that happening. Most animals that are alive now look exactly the same as they did when I was 10. Well, yeah, because we're talking about 30 years. We're not talking about the amount of time that it takes for actual change to accumulate. Just like watching time pass doesn't really seem like it's moving very fast. Or if you were to look at a child who grows up day by day by day, you don't notice that many differences as each day goes. And then eventually you look back and you see all of the time that has passed. So in retrospect, the history of the world can be seen as happening quite quickly. And so we have these two different models that explain how evolution works. The gradualist model says that our big changes are really just the accumulation of small, almost unnoticeable changes that eventually hit a threshold and we go, we see the change and now we notice the speciation. The other model says in punctuated equilibrium that we might see a whole bunch of change in a short period of time, followed by periods of relatively low change. For example, in the time of the evolution of the whale, from that small ancestor to the whale that we know today, that happened in a relatively quick amount of time, where mammals stayed kind of small and feeble and under the radar for most of the time that reptiles ruled the earth. Both things happen. Both the gradualist model and punctuated equilibrium can describe how evolution is happening, just in different sets of conditions. Guys, we have finished the chapter. I am proud of the work you've done, and we are ready for our quiz on this to be happening on Friday.